My name is Scott Dwyer. I'm a 2001 graduate of the Undergraduate College of the Stern School and a vice president of NYU's Alumni Association, elected just this past fall. The association is a group of dedicated alumni charged with, among many things, of connecting alumni us to the university through programming, communications, volunteer opportunities, and services. Tonight's speaker on the Square series is one of those programs. The series really means to bring us back to campus so that we can take advantage of the opportunities of listening and hearing from some of the university's most distinguished and interesting alumni and faculty. This is the 14th extraordinary speaker event of what is a program been going on for 7 years. All made possible through the dedicated efforts of alumni and friends like you here today. But tonight, we will hear the never-before-told true story concerning one of the most interesting moments in our nation's history, the development of the atomic bomb. And it's no coincidence that we're telling this story this month during Women's History Month, because this is the story of the thousands of women who were recruited by the US government in 1943 to serve the top secret Manhattan Project during World War II. This story is told in the book, The Girls of Atomic City, by NYU alumna Denise Kiernan, who will be speaking to you tonight and who I have the pleasure of introducing. Denise earned her BA in 1991 from the Washington Square and University College of Arts and Science, and her MA in 2002 from what is today the STEINHARDT School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. She has been working as a writer for more than 15 years, covering a variety of topics. She has been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Village Voice, Ms. Magazine, and many more national publications. She has also worked in television, serving as a head writer for ABC's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and has produced for ESPN and MSNBC. She has authored several popular historical titles, including Stuff Every American Should Know and Signing Their Lives Away, about the fame and misfortune of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. She has also ghostwritten books for athletes, entrepreneurs, and actresses. It is my pleasure to introduce Denise Kiernan.
Thank you very much. It is a real treat to be here at NYU, where I spent so many lovely years in so many teeny tiny apartments. So I want to thank the NYU Alumni Relations Organization for inviting me and allowing me to come back here and speak in this wonderful facility that wasn't even here when I was a student and remind me of how old I've gotten. But it is a lovely treat to get to come back as an alumna and talk about my latest work, this book, The Girls of Atomic City, that actually just came out last week from Touchstone Simon & Schuster. So The Girls of Atomic City is the true story of young women working in a secret government city during World War II. That city, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, existed solely for the purpose of enriching fuel for the first atomic bomb ever used in combat. However, the people who were working there, the vast majority of them, did not know that that was the purpose until the bomb detonated over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Oak Ridge, though there were many facilities in the United States that had something to do with what became known as the Manhattan Project, Oak Ridge was one of 3 primary sites, the other 2 being the Hanford Engineer Works outside Richland in Washington State, and Los Alamos in New Mexico, which is the town most of us think about when we think about the Manhattan Project, where scientists actually worked on researching and developing the actual bomb itself. Now, the original headquarters for the Manhattan Project was on this lovely island of Manhattan, but that was moved to Oak Ridge in 1943. And though it is not as well known as Los Alamos, Oak Ridge was the most populous of all the Manhattan Project sites. It's where the majority of the money for the Manhattan Project was spent. And it was also considered the administrative headquarters throughout the war and then became the headquarters for the Atomic Energy Commission. Okay, so am I on? I'm loud, but am I? Oh, I'm not on. Oh, Helen, okay. I'm on. So take a look at this picture. People always ask me how I found this story, and this photo was taken by Ed Westcott. Ed was the official photographer in Oak Ridge during World War II. And writers often come across stories while they're working on something else. It's kind of just happens. It's sort of annoying because you're supposed to be focusing on what you're doing, but one day I was working on a project that required that I look into recent developments in nuclear medicine. So I'm scooting around and I land on this photo, and it was on a Department of Energy website. It was in a little tiny newsletter that was focused on history of the facility. And I was really just kind of gripped by the interesting sort of vanishing point at the end of the room, and I had no idea what these machines were, and I also just looked, the faces of the women really sort of drew me in. Their little 1940s hairstyles and their posture. And so I looked at the caption, and the caption said, "These young women, many of them recent high school graduates from rural Tennessee, were enriching uranium for the world's first atomic bomb, only they did not know that." And I thought, oh, okay, I didn't know that either. And the first thing I thought was, this is just, my knowledge gap, because, we all have them. So I asked other people that I thought, knew a lot, and I knew a lot about, Los Alamos, but I really didn't know much of anything about Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And, honestly, when we think of the Manhattan Project, we often think of these folks. We think of Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi, and we think of Ernest Lawrence, and we think of Arthur Compton. And often when the story of the Manhattan Project is told, it is told through the eyes of the scientists and the decision makers and the generals and people who were in the know. And I just couldn't get that photo out of my mind, and I thought, well, who are these women? And there were thousands of them, and they clearly played a very significant role, so wouldn't it be compelling to look at this story through their eyes? And I think they offer a very unique perspective on what is really a great American secret story. So this is Celia, isn't she cute? So just set the stage for a second and just imagine you're 18, 19 years old. You're working as a secretary. In Celia's case, she was working at a secretary, about 30 blocks uptown. And your boss says, okay, we need to move the office. I'd really love for you to come with us. Are you interested? And you say, well, where are we going? Well, I can't really tell you specifically where we're going. It's going to be down south. Okay, what am I going to be doing? You'll be doing sort of the same thing that you're doing now. Okay, how long are we going for? Maybe 6 months, maybe longer, I don't know. And if you're Celia and you have a brother in the Philippines and you have another one who's getting ready to be shipped over to Italy, you say, yes, sure, absolutely, I will do whatever you want me to if you are telling me, because the only thing she did know was that the work she was going to do would help bring an end to the war. That was pretty much what she was told. So she gets on a train, gets a new dress, gets new shoes, one suitcase, some lipstick, and off she goes. She's told when to get off the train, and she's picked up at the station. And she was like many women at the time. Some of them were only coming across state. Some of them were coming from other states. And all they knew was they were going to a city somewhere in Tennessee, and the work they did there would be very secret, but it would be very important. So finally, if you're like Celia or any of these other women or men, you arrive at one of the gates. There were many gates at Oak Ridge. It was an enclosed reservation. They called it the reservation sometimes. There were guards and guns and dogs and barbed wire, and vehicles were stopped and inspected, and you were assigned badges. And this, if you can see, this is a residence pass. Everybody who lived on Oak Ridge had a residence pass. This says Clinton Engineer Works. That was the name the military gave the entire reservation. I don't know if you can see, but the first line after his hair color says, is a resident of Oak Ridge, which is what they used to refer to the livable areas where there was shopping and dormitories and things of that sort. There were also badges that determined where you could go as far as your job. So if you worked at a specific plant, you had a badge for that plant. You could not ever see the other plants. You could not get on a bus that was going to one of those other plants. All badges were worn at all times, even by children, and were monitored constantly. So here you are, and you arrive, and then you're going through a gate into a world that nobody else at the time doesn't really know exists. And this is what you see. So, and if you're coming from New York City, that looks a little different. So basically, they broke ground, and Oak Ridge did not exist before the war. So this town was created for the war. They broke ground late in 1942, and by the early 1945, it had gone from a mud pit to a city of 75,000 people with plants operating 24 hours a day and using more electricity at the time than New York City, and with one of the 10 largest bus systems in the entire country. Now, when you build a city that quickly, you can actually get a look at the map here. When you build a city that quickly and you're ripping up trees and the grade gets all messed up, when it rains in Tennessee, there's all that clay. It is just constant mud. Every person I interviewed, the first thing they wanted to talk to me about was mud. And so you can see here, I don't know if you can see up in the right corner that says Oak Ridge. So that was the first main living area on the reservation. And then there were eventually 4 main plants, 3 of which were dedicated to enriching uranium for the bomb, and another one that was a pilot nuclear reactor. One of those plants, and we'll see a picture of it a little later, was at the time the largest building on the planet, and in a town that was not yet on a map. So Celia arrives, and this is what she finds. So the new shoes went in the closet, and saddle shoes came out, and that was about it for her. Now, just because this was a secret site does not mean something this size and scale goes unnoticed by the surrounding area. So this is Tony, and Tony grew up down the road about 10 miles in the town of Clinton, Tennessee. Now, when Tony was graduating high school in 1943, things were really starting to rev up down the road, and everybody was trying to figure out what was going on. There were about 56,000 acres in East Tennessee that were taken by eminent domain to create Oak Ridge. So some farmers had as little as 2 weeks to get off their land. You'd find notices tacked up on your door or on your trees. And it all happened very, very quickly. And then, of course, the people who were going to work at the plant would come back to town because they would, commute, and they'd talk about all of these jobs that were available. Here you can see, this is an early construction picture. And in the early stages, you could actually see some of the fences for surrounding the reservation were actually being built using leftover barbed wire from some of the homes that had been taken over, and cows were running around, because they had just sort of been let out because people couldn't take them with them. So this was sort of the disarray that was surrounding them as Oak Ridge was beginning to take off. But what was funny is the theory was everything's going in and nothing's coming out. And everybody they knew who went to go work, they were asking them, well, what's going on over there? They're like, I don't know, but you're working there. I don't know. I'm just building. I'm building a building. I'm welding pipes. I'm doing this, that, or the other. And there were never any solid answers. So people like Tony thinking, when I turn 18, I'm going to work over there. I'm going to, see what this is all about, and I'm going to get a job. Well, everything going in, nothing coming out did not stop being a joke the entire run of the war, because when you have construction projects this large, you have a lot of train cars coming in all the time. And what would happen is the train cars would come up to the fence, up to the border of the reservation. The guys operating the Louisville and Nashville line would turn over control of the train and the goods to people working on the project, and they'd watch these trains go inside. Now, this is a city that eventually had, in a short time grew to 75,000 people. There were and these huge plants, there were hundreds of millions of feet of lumber, giant tankers of all sorts of chemicals, bricks, things to build houses, just food, all sorts of stuff. And these guys would turn over the train, watch this stuff go in, and then every train car that came back out was completely empty. And so this town kept growing and building, and people kept showing up to work on this war project, but they never saw anything come out. And that was, of course, because what they were doing, enriching uranium, is separating out the more fissionable isotope of uranium from the naturally occurring uranium that they were mining and getting to Oak Ridge. So you have all of these train cars and trucks and vehicles 24 hours a day, and then you have a couple of teaspoons in a coffee mug in a briefcase attached to somebody's wrist going out. So it was, that was the biggest mystery there, is no one could figure out what on earth was going on because they never saw anything leave. I put this in here because I like it. That is one of my favorite Rockwell, because to me it really captures what was going on with women during World War II. They were doing everything. So I love this because she's got a nurse cap on, she's got a bus driver hat on, she's got a wrench, she's going to dig her victory garden, she still has milk because she's still taking care of her family. And when the women arrived at Oak Ridge, many of their jobs were as varied as they would have been in other parts of the United States, because there was an entire city to run. So some worked administratively, people had to be assigned to dorms and those sorts of things, and some operated Geiger counters, although they probably didn't call them that at the time. Here we have a closer look at those large machines I showed at the beginning of the image that got me hooked on this story in the first place. That's a cubicle operator minding the panels of a Calutron in the Y12 plant. There are some bus drivers. Oh, I love this one. This is, because the entire facility ran 24 hours a day, the phones had to be always running, and so you can see these ladies waiting to take over to make sure no calls are missed during the shift change. And this is another element of New York that was brought down to Oak Ridge. As more families grew, they had schools, and they also wanted activities for the people who were living there. And so they decided we should have we should have a library, among other things. And this is Elizabeth Edwards, and she had been one of the main librarians at the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue. And they brought her down to work in Oak Ridge and start the library system. And there was the Women's Army Corps, of course. Some of them were assigned to work in Oak Ridge in various capacities. Tony, the young woman I showed at the beginning of this sequence, actually worked across the hall from a group of these women, and noticed that all they ever did was sit around and read newspapers and magazines. And she didn't know what was going on, and she didn't ask, because you weren't supposed to ask questions, and found out after the war that there was an entire team of WACs, and all they did was look for use of words like uranium and fission and things like that that would have violated existing censorship. And the word was those people, if they were caught using those words, would get a visit from someone from the War Department. And there's a little K-25 Rosie the Riveter. And of course, there were housewives, people who had come either with husbands who were plumbers or husbands who were scientists. And because there were rations in Oak Ridge, just like there were rations everywhere else in the country for gas and sugar, and cigarettes were hard to come by sometimes, and everybody wanted ivory flakes, and you could never find them when you needed them. There were a lot of lines, and it was difficult for housewives, because getting around town in all the mud with kids and wagons and such was a little trying. That's Helen. So who were these women? So I went over to Oak Ridge. I found out it wasn't too far from where I was living at the time. And I started tracking down existing women. And what was interesting was what they kept saying every time I talked to them, and other people would say too, is, well, why do you want to talk to them? They don't know anything. They didn't know anything. So because they weren't in the know, it was as though their story was being devalued. But you start talking to them, and the stuff that they would share was just so fascinating. So Helen was recruited out of a diner drugstore in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, when she heard about this town somewhere in the eastern part of the state, was what she was told. She could get 79 cents an hour, and she got on a bus the next day. That's Rosemary. She was a young nurse from Iowa who was working in Chicago and was told she was going to go down to a city in Tennessee and help start a clinic, but she couldn't be told where. That's Jane, a young statistician from Paris, Tennessee. And that's Celia, the woman who was in the very first picture, who was the secretary in Manhattan that was taken this summer. She's going to be 94 in May. And this is Colleen. She came over with her family from Nashville. And this is this is a service star. This is a gold star. Colleen's family was among many families that had children or other loved ones fighting. You hung a blue star in your window if you had someone who was fighting, and if it was a gold star, that meant someone had actually died. So this is one of many posters you would have seen in a variety of places all over the United States, not just on Manhattan Project facilities, that says, of course, this is a gold star because somebody talked. There's Colleen's badge when she was a youngin'. She came when she was about 18 years old with roughly 10, 11 people from her immediate family, a lot of brothers and sisters. And she worked at that building I mentioned earlier, K25. So this is the one I mentioned before. That was at the time the largest building under one roof in the world. 44 acres of floor space by the time it was finished. Shaped like a U, not very subtle. And Colleen's family, like many other families, especially in the K25 area, lived in trailers. And basically what happened is they thought that they originally planned that Oak Ridge was going to be around 13,000 people. And they blew through that very, very quickly. And then they had to just keep on building. So they would put up trailer camps as quickly as they could. At one point, there were close to 9 people from Colleen's family in one of these trailers. And she would talk about how they would sleep. It was 24-hour shifts. So you would sleep in shifts, eat in shifts, work in shifts. Whoever was around to take care of the youngest kids, you took care of the youngest kids. So it was quite intense. And she would also joke about going to work. And she would leave, get on the bus, go to the plant, finish her shift, come back, and in the time she'd been away, at least 10 new houses had gone up. And actually, at the height of construction, it was estimated that there was some sort of domicile being erected once every 30 minutes. Okay, that says K25 conditioning pipe vats. So Colleen worked as a leak tester. Basically, she worked in a room much like this. I don't know if you can see up there that there are these little tiny cars kind of going across the top of the ceiling, and there's a man in there. And so the millwrights would bring in these pipes and lower them down, and Colleen and others like her would test the welds to make sure that they didn't leak. And then they'd finish and they'd mark ones that were leaking, et cetera, and then the millwrights would pick up the pipes and take them away. And she had to wear pants. This was crazy, Only Katharine Hepburn and Marlene Dietrich wore pants, and only fast women wore bobby socks. And, so she had to get used to doing all that. Some of the pipes were so big, she actually had to get a ladder and climb on them. And her world was pipes. And it was very interesting to me when I would talk to people how, because you weren't allowed to talk about your work and you weren't allowed to go to other areas of the reservation, your view of what was going on there was very much influenced by what you saw every day. So Colleen's view was pipes. And, as far as she said, what did I know? She said, where did the pipes come from? That door over there. Where were the pipes going? That door over there. What's behind that door back there? Probably more pipes. So her whole world was pipes. Now I interviewed another woman who had a friend who was convinced she knew what was going on during the war and that it had something to do with urine. Because her job was processing people, and all she did all day was take urine samples. She was absolutely positive the whole thing had something to do with urine. This is Katie with her nearly 70-year-old biscuit pans. I'll explain what those are in a moment. Katie was a janitor from Auburn, Alabama. Oak Ridge was segregated. You can see that's the white outhouse, and the other is labeled colored. Everything was segregated. There were separate cafeterias, separate post offices, separate recreational facilities. The men and women, even though they were married, were not allowed to live together. So the men and women, all blacks, lived in hutments. They called it the black hutment area. And the women's hutments were actually surrounded by another barbed wire fence that had an additional guard. And Katie and her friends said they used to joke and started calling it the pen. They lived in the pen. And she, you know, it was a really very difficult experience for the African American community working on the Manhattan Project. The pay was so substantial, though, and so much greater than what she would have been able to earn back home in Alabama, that both she and her husband came to work at Oak Ridge. The most difficult part for her by a long shot was the fact that black couples were not only not allowed to live together, they were not allowed to bring their children. So she had to leave her children behind as well with her mother, so she would take money and send it home whenever she could. But the African American community was on the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge from very early on. One gentleman who lived in the Hutman area helped lay the very first slab in that big building, K25. This is a very early picture from it says the colored huts and personnel. So they played a major role in the Manhattan Project, and the segregation was so strict that Ernest Wilkins, very famous mathematician, PhD, brilliant, who was working at the metallurgical lab in Chicago that was also a main hub for Manhattan Project research, and he was supposed to be transferred down to Oak Ridge, but they decided against it because he was black, so he was never transferred down to Oak Ridge. So Oak Ridge is lost for sure in that case. When I did my research, a lot of it was done on site in Oak Ridge, but a lot of it was done at the National Archives in Atlanta. National Archives has various regional facilities. The one in Atlanta has files from the Southeast United States, including Tennessee. And this was actually, these are complaint letters from the Colored Camp Council president that went to the head of his construction organization and also to President Roosevelt. Detailing some of the harassment they felt that their wives were getting in the Hutman area. So these actually came from the FEPC files in Atlanta, not from the Atomic Energy Commission files. But now I'll bring you back to the biscuit pans. So one of the things Katie hated most was the cafeteria, because she said the food was horrible. And there were actually many letters complaining about the food. So she really, really wanted to figure out a way how she could cook in her hut. And all the hut had was, it was 16 by 16, so that's roughly 250 something, math, square feet of living space for 4 people. And there was a wood stove in the middle with a pipe going right out of the roof. Well, one day Katie was working and there were some welders nearby, and she noticed that they'd weld and they'd toss these scraps aside, and she yelled up to one of them, she said, "Make me a biscuit pan." And sure enough, she came the next day and this guy had 3 fairly rectangular pans for her. And so what she did is she figured out, you couldn't put the pans right on top of the stove because it got too hot, but she figured out a way to lean them, and she would bake biscuits, and she actually told me she used them to bribe the guards to get more visiting time with her husband. Good for her. This is Jane, the young statistician we saw earlier in the pictures. Jane wanted to be an engineer. She was online to matriculate at the University of Tennessee and was tapped on the shoulder and told, no, girls can't be engineers. But we have this very exciting business administration statistic program you can be in. So Jane actually graduated as the very first woman at the University of Tennessee to graduate with that degree. And at Oak Ridge, she surveyed a team of young women who operated these hand calculators. They were being given numbers from somewhere, they weren't told where, and they had these complex calculations to do that were actually helping determine production rates for the plants. And they worked 24 hours a day, and Jane oversaw that team. It was actually a very, very important position. You can see she made in, let's see, it's about between $39 and $42 a week she was making. But the little post-it up in the corner she added, and it says, so we can see it better here, had men working under me making more than me. So she had gone through her files and written a post-it in later years and stuck that on there. Now, how does a site that is so big stay relatively secret? Lack of the kind of technology we have today certainly helps. There were also a lot of reminders posted everywhere. Now, there was a fair amount of, there were many billboards encouraging people to be quiet throughout the United States and also in other countries during World War II. I think we've all probably heard the phrase, loose lips sink ships. And if you worked in plants, you should be very careful about what you were saying. In Oak Ridge, it was very important that people didn't say anything about what they did. And so in addition to billboards like the ones you see here that were there during the war, there was an official security division that would monitor badges and make sure people didn't group together and talk in large groups in public, and would make sure that if you were on a bus, you had the right badge to go where you were supposed to go, and make sure if you didn't have the right color stripe, you didn't use the wrong bathroom. Everything was very controlled. But they also had informants. And a lot of people were approached to inform on their coworkers and the people that they lived with. One of the women I feature actually was in that situation. She was 18 years old, was approached outside her dorm by two men who said, would she please, listen in on conversations, see if people are being a little too free with their information. And if they were, she was given a stack of envelopes and these forms to fill out. She'd put down the name of the person if she knew it, where the conversation occurred, and what was discussed. And they said, don't worry, it's very anonymous. You just put it in these envelopes. And it was like Acme Insurance Company, like something out of Wile E. Coyote, And in Acme Insurance in Knoxville, Tennessee, and was dropped in these anonymous boxes. And that's how a number of people informed on other people living there. So you knew walking around, if you were asking too many questions, somebody might be listening. If you were talking too freely, somebody might be listening. But people also self-censored a lot too, because they did not want to be responsible for derailing the war effort. So there was a lot of self-censorship going on too. I just love this picture of Ed's, so I just put it in here. So this to me is sort of a real combination of Oak Ridge at its most interesting in a way, because they thought of it as a military reservation, but it wasn't really, because there were a ton of civilians there. And of course, a lot of those people had families. And so you have Girl Scouts, because everybody needs something to do, and Girl Scouts is a wonderful organization. And so these are the Girl Scouts going on a little walk in the shadow of one of the reactors. Now, as you might imagine, working under these conditions can lead to stress. So one other thing they did not plan on, but eventually became a part of Oak Ridge, was Dr. Eric Clark was brought in to work as a psychiatrist and to set up mental health facilities, limited, but they were there. His reports are fascinating. They're in the Atomic Energy Commission files in Atlanta. And he was so struck by the extremes that he saw. Some people thought Oak Ridge was the best place in the world. I mean, for some young girls living in the dorm, for some it was just like colleges they'd left, and for others it was like colleges they would never be able to go to. They had good pay. They felt good about what they were doing because they were helping end the war effort. He said it was particularly difficult for housewives who were living at home because they didn't have the same kind of routine. And one of the other stressors was you could not discuss what you were doing with your husband. So your husband would come home from work and it was never sort of, how was your day? What were you doing? Those conversations never took place. And I would talk to him and we would say at a certain point, I didn't know what to say when he came home. So, you just ate dinner and that was it. And getting back and forth, there were a lot of lines, as there were in many parts of the country. And getting around could be very stressful for women who were living at home and taking care of children. One of the things they did in order to try and make this more livable is they started early on in establishing various recreational activities. And it went from, one dance a week to eventually there were 3 dances every week, outdoor dances, indoor dances. There were bowling leagues. There were fundraisers to buy bombers. The kids had high school football games that you could go to. Of course, the opposing teams never got a roster of the Oak Ridge players because somebody might recognize the last name of a child and put that with a particular scientist and then know that that scientist was in Oak Ridge. So there were never any rosters given out. I love that, that's a little bowling league shot. And so these were established to try and take some of the edge off because one of the larger stressors was everything was operating 24 hours a day. If you lived in the trailer camps, they had giant floodlights, so that people get back and forth from the buses and be able to see in the dark. So there was this feeling of never really being at rest when you were there. And you're also being told that you've got to meet this deadline and we have to hurry and we have to go and we have to produce, but you don't know what the deadline is and you don't know what it's about. So that was also frustrating for a lot of people, whether they were in a very menial position or whether they were a chemist in one of the labs. This is a picture from August 14th, 1945. So in August of 1945, Oak Ridge finally found out what the purpose of the reservation had been. Now, for a lot of them, the first trickle of information was just there was this new super bomb that had been detonated over Japan, and then they hear the president's address and they hear Oak Ridge mentioned. And it turned the entire town. I mean, it was an incredible moment for a lot of people, and also one that evolved over time because everyone was so thrilled the war was over, but as the devastation became more clear and more information began to trickle out, it became a very complicated set of feelings for a lot of the people involved. And everyone was so happy when so many millions had gone, and pretty much every woman I interviewed had somebody who was fighting. And so that feeling of elation was mixed for a lot of them with a feeling of, my gosh, we were part of something that has changed the entire world. Now, Oak Ridge was designed for the war. They were not thinking about what it was going to be after, what they were going to do. This particular memo from the head of the medical unit, I feel, kind of captures that in a certain way. This is a memo going from Dr. Ray, and he's talking about the number of deaths that had happened in the Oak Ridge Hospital in the last several months. And number 3 down there says, so we're wondering if maybe we should have a funeral home at some point. And it was just one of those things that they had never really thought about, those kinds of facilities, funeral homes, cemeteries. They thought about secretaries. They had the focus was so narrow that this community kind of took off while they weren't necessarily planning for it. There was a lot of concern for some people because after living there for several years, they had actually become to feel quite at home there. These are people waiting online to get cigarettes outside of one of the recreational halls. The average age was 26 or 27 years old. There were a lot of young single women. There were a lot of young single men. People hung out. They went to dances. They went on dates. They got married. They had babies, and they started orchestras. And there were all sorts of things that these seeds of community, whether the government had planned for them or not, they were there. And they had already begun to sprout in a lot of ways. So although some of the plants began to shut down what they were doing after the war, they were also getting the message that they needed to stay on the job to win the peace, they were told. And a lot of people just did not want to leave. Some people couldn't get out of there fast enough, but there were a lot of people who didn't want to leave. Many of the women I interviewed have been there now. Celia, who was told, I can't tell you where you're going. I can't tell you what you're going to be doing. Probably 6 to 9 months. Well, Celia's been there about 70 years now, and she's had grandkids and great-grandkids that have all grown up there. I like that picture. So it was an unexpected community, but it was sort of a Just Add Water town, but was also, it was a Just Add Women town. They were planting gardens and, decorating their homes and really putting down roots in putting down roots in all the mud. There's another little garden going up. These were prefab homes. So many kids. Yeah, that one's good. Let's go back to that one. Wait. Little tiny boxing match. But this was, there were, oh my gosh, we need more schools. Oh my gosh, we need buses for the schools. All these sorts of things that when you're just going in to build plants, you're not thinking about the fact that all these people you're putting in this confined area are probably going to start having families. I want you to notice that several of these women are holding their washboards because nobody liked the laundry because it ate your clothes. But nobody wanted their washboards stolen. So when Ed asked them to come out and have their photo taken, they're like, I have to take my washboard. I can't live without my washboard. So I'm going to just give a little plug about doing oral histories in your community. If you know anyone who was involved with the Manhattan Project on any level, who is still alive, the Atomic Heritage Foundation collects, the project is called the Voices in the Manhattan Project, and they will do oral histories with anyone involved. They're trying to gather as much information as possible because, like a lot of the women that I talked to, these stories have not been recorded. There are also other general oral history projects with the Library of Congress and other places for any veteran of any war. And most local libraries take oral histories and just, sit down with a grandparent or a great-grandparent and just take some notes and bring a tape recorder and give it to your local library. It's a worthwhile thing to do. Now, in the last, I would say, even within the last week, when I was online, I could see things like, you often see these stories. We need a Manhattan Project for, so we need a Manhattan Project for childhood obesity. We need a Manhattan Project for mapping the brain. We need a Manhattan Project for climate change. We need a Manhattan Project for energy independence. The Manhattan Project itself, in that terminology, has really penetrated our culture. Yet a recent survey done at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., 90% of the people who had gone through the museum that actually had an atomic spy exhibit had no idea what the Manhattan Project even was. And, the nuclear medicine, nuclear weaponry, nuclear energy continue to have a tremendous impact on our personal, political, and economic landscape. And you can draw a line from most of those 2013 conversations right back to these Tennessee high school girls. So that's why I wanted to talk to them. I found their perspectives to be refreshing and compelling and very honest and interesting, and I hope you do too. And I thank you for letting me talk to you about them for a little while. And now we have time for some questions, I believe. So if people have questions, I think they're supposed to, there are microphones. You can walk up to a microphone if you want to ask a question.
Were any of them, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, I wasn't even paying attention. Go ahead.
Were any of the people who worked there exposed to radiation?
The short answer to that is yes. The real answer is much, much larger. There was so much less understood about radiation at the time. There is today a program with the Department of Energy that offers financial settlements to people who had worked on the Manhattan Project in certain facilities who have developed cancer. My book doesn't focus on that aspect of the story, but actually that is a story that is really still being written and still being examined. Yes, ma'am?
That was part of my question, but the other
Okay.
question is, what about the land there? Is that closed off because of radiation?
Actually, also a very complex answer. So the Oak Ridge National Lab exists today, as does Y12. They're in different forms than they were in 1945, obviously. The Oak Ridge National Lab is known throughout the world and is a very large facility. There is also the largest supply of the United States enriched uranium is still in Oak Ridge in a new facility that they put up, I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I might be wrong about that. K25, the giant U building, is in the process of being demolished. The North Tower just came down, I want to say a month ago, maybe. And contamination is an issue. And it's not just the radioactive materials. I think when we think about the Manhattan Project, our mind automatically goes to uranium and plutonium, but there was a ton of mercury there. There was a ton of fluorine there. A lot of the kinds of chemicals that you'd find in not just in a Manhattan Project site, but also just in large industrial sites. So there is a lot of cleanup that goes on. And yes.
And how many people are still living there?
Oh, the town of Oak Ridge today, do you mean just the population or do you mean people who worked on the Manhattan Project?
Well, both.
Both? I don't know the answer to the second one, but we're trying to find out. The town of Oak Ridge has about 28,000 people now. Mm-hmm. So it's about half the size of what it was in 1945.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Denise, for bringing out this amazing, incredible story and bringing it to light. And as a School of Ed grad, I'm proud to have a School of Ed person there. And just sort of thinking out loud in terms of like the fact that this story, the secret story that was brought out, has to do with the weapon that could wipe out humanity, Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking that in terms of like Howard Zinn, when he wrote The People's History of the United States.
Yeah.
From the perspective of the victims, of the people who were always left out. And I'm wondering, thinking going forward and moving towards a world based on love and peace and caring, and if we could have a Manhattan Project for peace, that would be great.
Or one for homelessness.
Or,
I mean, think about it. If you put this kind of effort into, sure.
I'm just wondering how this kind of narrative and storytelling that's based on uncovering the secrets and really being honest, if there's not a connection between that and moving toward a world that we don't have to worry about being blown up.
I'd love to think that there is. I love Howard Zinn. I love that book. I think any moment in history, it's important to examine from as many different perspectives as possible, different gender perspectives, race perspectives, economic perspectives, and not just take it from the point of view of the people who, were in charge, the important people. Going forward, right now there are 5,000 boxes about this size in the back vault, climate-controlled vault of the National Archives in Atlanta. 5,000 boxes. It's like you walk back and there's like the last scene of the first Indiana Jones movie when they go put the Grail away. That's what it feels like back there. And what's amazing is it's not just went on during the war. I mean, after the war, the Manhattan Project became the Atomic Energy Commission and then became various other acronyms down the road. And a ton of the majority of those boxes still have not been, the archivists have a special word, assessed, I want to say it is, or fully filed and fully examined. Who knows what's in what I find amazing is how many secrets there still are just for this particular story. But I do think, the first step is, getting it out there and learning and talking. And yes, then, gosh, I hope we can and strive for a Manhattan Project to, end world hunger. That would be nice. Thank you. Hello.
Hi. This is just absolutely fascinating. I agree with that gentleman.
Thank you.
One of the things that came to mind, you talked about interviewing some of the workers that were there, and you also talked about the fact that there were families there.
Mm-hmm.
Were you able to find and talk to any of those who were children there, growing up there, and what schooling and what experience they had?
I have. That's a great question. I'm often in touch with a lot of the children and still am. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to Washington, D.C. because I'm going to be talking at the archives, and I'm finally going to meet two of the daughters of Rosemary, who's all still alive and is going to come to the talk. I deal with the children a lot sometimes when I'm not in town because maybe one of these women does email, and then everybody else is, and the phone calls are crazy because most of them, Helen can't hear anymore, so I'm like, it's Denise, I'm screaming. So I often interact with the children, and the one thing they'll talk about is because they had brought so many incredible scientists into this town, the high school and the teachers were amazing. And Oak Ridge High School was, for years, and I don't know about right now, but for many years, it was one of the best high schools you could, just merit scholars all over the place. And, it was fascinating. The ones who remember when the gate opened, when the gates came down in 1949, a lot of them had just kind of gotten used to it. It was like they were in their own little private world, and then suddenly, you needed a new police force, and people could come and go as they pleased, and it was an adjustment. Some of them remember it fondly. Some of them hated the fact that there were gates and and all that sort of stuff. So it varied. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for presenting this. I mean, I'm just
thank you.
amazed that this happened shortly before I was born.
Yeah.
And I had two questions that came to mind while I was watching your presentation. One was, you mentioned that a lot of people had died. Well, what did they die of during the time that they were there?
Oh, the memo that I showed when they
Yes.
were talking about whether or not they needed a funeral home. There had been actually one of the 30 of the people mentioned in that specific memo had actually died in the Jellicoe train wreck, which some World War II buffs may have heard of. No? Okay. It was actually considered one of the largest number of an event that caused one of the largest numbers of casualties in the United States.
Wow.
during the run of the war. And it was a train wreck very close to Oak Ridge, so Oak Ridges sent doctors over, and they were carrying soldiers. It was a train car full of soldiers who were getting ready to head off, and they carrying them up the ravine, and they had brought a bunch into the clinic, and 30 or 33 of them, something like that, died. So that was one of them. And car accidents, the occasional car accident or Jeep, and an electrician. There was one of my women saw an electrocution. Somebody forgot to hang. You remember grounding hooks, big wooden stick and a big metal. Forgot to hang a grounding hook before he opened up one of the machines. So things of that nature.
So it had nothing to do with atomic energy and radiation exposure?
If it did, I didn't come across that file, and no one told me.
Okay.
You'd be amazed how many women today were still. I was talking to Dot, who was one of the main women in the book, and she's hilarious and very, very saucy and very funny. And I was talking with her and her husband was her supervisor. She was one of the women who worked in front of those panels. And her husband was her supervisor. That's how they met, and that was totally common. And he was talking about how, well, if you talked, they sent you to the Aleutian Islands. I said, they what? He said, they sent you to the Aleutian Islands, and you stayed there until the war was over. Dot said, they didn't send you to the Aleutian Islands. So they get in this argument, and then all of a sudden, Dot goes, we shouldn't be talking about this. And she was dead serious. I said, it's been 65 years. She goes, it just feels wrong. And another guy came up to me at Every year, Oak Ridge has the Secret City Festival, which if you ever find yourself in the area of Knoxville, Tennessee, is worth a trip. Because it is like most summer festivals, so there are, bouncy houses and cover bands. And then you can go tour nuclear reactors. It's this very, they have atomic hot wings. It's this very strange mix of things going on. And this guy came up to me at one of the events and he said, I would love for my mother to talk to you, but she refuses. And I said, why? He goes, she's not supposed to. She still believes she's not supposed to. It's amazing.
And here's my other question.
Yes.
You mentioned that trains would come in, they would bring things in, and nothing would leave.
Yes.
So what
well, the
happened?
trains would leave.
Well, the trains would leave. But what happened to all the waste that was accumulated from...
Well, they had 56,000 acres.
So it didn't matter, they just buried it.
It was, they buried it in the best, and I do have some of the documents from the waste disposal section. It was the best possible way they knew how to do so at the time, but not compare. It wouldn't pass muster today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Everybody, just so we can respect Denise's time, everybody who's at the mic right now will handle your questions, and then we'll wrap it up, if that's okay.
And then we'll sign.
Yes.
I will stick around to sign.
You want to take her?
Oh, hello.
Was there male censorship?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, that's a great question. Celia, the young woman who was, they showed at the very beginning, who was heading down to Tennessee from Washington, she gets a call from her mother at one point saying, stop writing me, which is not something mothers usually say to their young daughters. And she said, why? She goes, everything you're sending has all these black bars going through it. I can't make any sense of it. And of course, this makes Celia highly paranoid because now she's like, I didn't think I said anything. What did I say? Was I talking about, because then she just started, making herself crazy, trying to figure out what it was she had said that was wrong and needed to be censored. So yes, they did.
A follow-up on one of your thoughts, when you were talking about how they could not speak even now about what occurred.
Some of them, yes.
Yeah, there's like a great line from Shawshank Redemption. They became institutionalized to
Sure.
such a large degree.
Yeah.
It's almost like the atomic energy version of A League of Their Own.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe you said that. A friend of mine who just picked up the book said, I love the cover. I can totally see Gina Davis with her baseball glove walking with the women. So now I want to Photoshop the cover of the book to put Gina Davis and Madonna in there.
That's exactly what hit me when I saw your cover.
Yeah.
Is there, first of all, two questions and I'm done. One, is there a movie on this coming out? And number two, have you heard of the Brookhaven National Lab on Long Island?
Oh, absolutely. We actually know someone who works there.
It's an interesting parallel to some of the stuff that went in Oak Ridge.
Oh, sure.
Amazing.
And there are interesting stories that can come out of Los Alamos, and there are interesting stories that can come out of Hanford, and Berkeley and Chicago, and so many places. There are interesting conversations taking place. That's all I can say.
I'm voting for Madonna, the second on the right.
Second on the right? Noted. Duly noted. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to share, as African American, I had never heard of this. But when I saw, the degree of segregation, the hairs just stood up on my arms. I mean,
sure.
I couldn't believe it. And then to say that they couldn't bring their children,
It's heartbreaking.
it's just amazing that the government went through so much trouble to do all of that.
Well, and...
I mean, it's not like second class, it's like 10th class.
Oh, yeah. And they probably didn't, for example, when I was talking about Ernest Wilkins, the mathematician, PhD, he was working on the Manhattan Project in Chicago. There was no problem there. There was no segregation there. There was no problem there. They could have established
We all know
Oak Ridges.
segregation was going on in society
Yeah.
during that time. But on a project like this, you wouldn't think that they would.
I agree.
It's amazing.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The building here in the West Village, I believe that was part of the Manhattan Project on Bethune Street, right along West Street.
The one they just converted over?
It now has the High Line Park, which was the railroad track that went into the building on the second floor. I believe that was part of the Manhattan Project.
There's a really wonderful book that I'll recommend. It's called Never mind. No, it's something like cities, Manhattan Project. Help me. Manhattan and the Manhattan Project. Basically, it's a tiny book. You can actually get it from the Atomic Heritage Foundation, and you can find it on Amazon and other places. And basically, it is a little guidebook to all of the different sites in Manhattan that were dedicated to the Manhattan Project. So you could actually walk around and still go see these buildings. So you should look for that book. You'd probably get it's for anybody here. It's a very interesting little piece of walking history.
I just wanted to speak as the employee of Brookhaven National Laboratory. It is a scientific laboratory that has very little classified research. Most of what we do there is wide open, published in the scientific literature. But my question was, were there any female scientists working?
Yes, there were. There absolutely were. And there were a couple, there were not a huge amount, but there were a couple, there were definitely some physicists. One of my women was a chemist and worked in a lab. Her friend, who I did not interview in person, but interviewed long distance, it was not one of the main women, she was also a chemist. But there were also other women in the project in general that I mentioned in the book, like Ida Nodak, who brought up the idea of fission 4 years before they decided to listen to her. And Lise Meitner, who actually explained what fission was, but didn't really get, I think, the right amount of credit for what she did. And then people like it was more noticeable in places that were smaller, like Los Alamos. And Joan Hinton was there. She died just a couple years ago. She was a brilliant scientist. So there were some at Oak Ridge, and there's still a few floating around. I interviewed a couple who actually arrived right after the end of the war, and it's really fascinating stuff. And in fact, this one woman, Leanne Russell, you may have heard of. She's actually responsible for. She helped identify the Y chromosome. She got to go to Oak Ridge because her husband, who was also a scientist, demanded that she get her own job in her own lab, or else he wasn't going to come. So it's like, good for him. So, thank you all so much. I'll hang around for a little while. Thank you.
Just on behalf of the Alumni Association, we want to thank everybody here, Denise especially, for this wonderful talk. Not without the most important part is that you can take this talk with you, because the Girls of Atomic City are available. The book is available for purchase and signing by Denise at the back of the auditorium. So please, if you are able, please pick up a copy on your way out. Just before the event concludes, I just want to remind you of a few upcoming marquee NYU events that are going on throughout 2013. On April 10th, a Wednesday, we have the Alumni Awards Luncheon at the Hilton, New York, which is 53rd and 6th Avenue. This year, we will be honoring the accomplishments of people of alumni in law, education, entertainment, the Honorable Raymond Lawyer, Dr. Charlotte Frank, Jane Rosenthal, and Lauren Burke. And registration by Friday, March 15th, guarantees an early bird discounted registration fee. Thursday, May 9th, an additional Speakers on the Square event with NYU President John Sexton. His topic will be his new book and the most popular undergraduate course at NYU right now, Baseball as a Road to God. And finally, way in the future, but still this year, Saturday, October 19th, put it on your calendar, NYU Alumni Day again, a chance to come back to the campus again for education, for friendship, and fun to celebrate the best of NYU. So thank you again for coming. Thank you, Denise, and have a great evening. Thank you so much.